Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Adversaries are doing stranger things. Today's featured speaker is Brian Ullman. Brian boasts a wealth of experience in incident response, security architecture, pen testing, and threat hunting. He also teaches Sec 599, defeating advanced adversaries, purple team tactics, and kill chain defenses. If during the webcast you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording will be available for viewing in the next 48 hours, all of which can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Brian.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. So, adversaries are doing stranger things. Now, how did I come up with this particular presentation? I work in an MDR practice. I am principal security researcher for Presidio, and I work in an MDR practice. I do security research, and we started seeing adversaries doing all sorts of strange things in intrusions. And also, we had a lot of information coming in from our threat intelligence groups that we work with that told us about these strange things that adversaries were doing. So we started seeing it more and more and more and more. So the point of this presentation is to make you aware of these strange things that we see adversaries doing. It's not the normal stuff. So I will get into that in much more detail as we go forward. But why are we seeing adversaries do this? We're seeing adversaries do this because detection has gotten so much better. We have EDR, we have SIM. These have become pervasive tools throughout the industry. It used to be when I would ask my customers, do you have SIM? It would be, oh yeah, we don't have one. Now it's, oh yes, we have one. Can you help us, right? EDR, this is table stakes now. Everybody's got an EDR of some kind. When I talk to customers, we've got CrowdStrike, we've got Palo Alto XDR, we've got SentinelOne. So this has made it much harder for the adversary to get by, right? Also, when you get into the very advanced security posture customers, they have breach and attack simulation software where they're taking and simulating the activities of APT groups in their environment, right? So they're simulating these behaviors, making it much, much harder for the adversary to do what they need to do or what they're used to doing when they're executing their, tools or when they have got a foothold in your environment. But that being said, that has pushed adversaries into different types. And so we have multiple types of adversaries, right? We have the advanced persistent threat, which most of us know, that is the very advanced groups. That's like Turla and Clop, like I've mentioned here on the slide. Turla, super advanced. They're a nation state backed actor in most cases, at least as far as we know, we guess that they're a nation state backed actor. But they've done some very amazing things. They've used satellites for C2 beacons, right? They've used Instagram for their C2. They're mostly concerned about espionage, right? Turla, concerned about espionage. So they're very, very well funded. And what has happened with groups like this is they've just gone very, very technically advanced, right? They're like, yeah, we can bypass your EDR. We can bypass your SIM. We don't care. Then we have adversaries like Clop. This is a good representation of a ransomware group. And many of you probably remember MoveIT and what happened with Clop and what they did, how brazen that was. They found a 0-day in MoveIT software, and they attacked the entire web. And then they took all of those victims that they had and they put them up on a website and said, yeah, if they don't pay us, we're going to publish this information, right? So we have very, very advanced threat actors. And then we have other threat actors, and they're a bit derpy at times, right? And as you can see, there's a Stranger Things theme throughout this presentation. So you'll have some memes from Stranger Things here. But most other threat actors, they just do strange things, but it still works. So we call them at SANS, we call them the adequate persistent threat. And I think it was Phil Hagen who coined that term. But the adequate persistent threat is still a threat. It still gets by EDR. It still gets by SIM. They just do it in very strange ways, right? So that's what we're going to focus on in this presentation is the things that the adequate persistent threats are doing, not the advanced persistent threat. So us as red teamers and purple teamers, our mission is to emulate the adversary, right? We need to emulate the adversary and what that adversary would do, right? If we're not emulating the adversary, if we're not emulating the adequate persistent threat, then we're not doing our job as purple and red teamers, right? And that's part of the reason that I put this stuff in this presentation is that if we're not doing these tactics that you may not be aware of, we're not doing our jobs, right? We want to make sure that we are emulating the adversary effectively. Adversary emulation, like I mentioned, the whole job of red teamers and purple teamers is adversary emulation. We exist to make the blue team better. Well, if we don't know these tactics, we don't know what the adversaries are doing, we're not keeping up to date with what we're doing, we're not testing what they're doing, then we have failed as a team, right? We need to make sure that we are emulating the adversary effectively. Now, good approaches are MITRE ATT&CK, right? But as you'll see, as I'm going through this presentation, not all of these techniques are in MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK, of course, a good place to start, but it's not always perfect. And we need to know this as purple and red teamers, right? We need to know that MITRE ATT&CK is not the end all be all. It's a starting point. We still have to use threat intelligence. We still have to figure out what the adversary is doing and emulate that effectively. So as we can all agree, this looks like a typical intrusion, right? We have phishing, exposed RDP, weak credentials in our initial compromise, internet-facing systems being compromised. We have cobalt strike beacons. We still see cobalt strike beacons all the time, still a very common method of adversaries getting a foothold. Payloads, web shells, credential dump compromises, logging into VPNs, all of those different things. Escalation of privileges, we'll see Mimikatz usage, searching for passwords, Bloodhound, proc dump. Cobalt Strike, still we'll see that in the discovery phase. We'll see recon scripts, NS lookup, PowerSploit, PowerView, especially invoke ShareFinder, very, very common when looking at intrusions. And then we'll see lateral movement. This could be any of the most significant techniques. Cobalt Strike beacons, of course, RDP, tunneling, sliver, PSExec, and data exfiltration. And on actions and objectives, we're seeing data being pushed to cloud constantly through FTP, through different mechanisms. And then, of course, ransomware deployment via WMIC, very, very common, right? So I think we can all agree that this is a pretty common attack path. But is it? Is this really what adversaries are doing? Well, they are, but they're not always, right? And I want to show you some techniques that we'll fill in each one of these with some of the techniques they're doing towards the end of the presentation. So for the first phase, foothold, initial access. Phishing is still the most common vector, right? We're still seeing phishing constantly. It is the most common vector. But phishing is a little different than it used to be. Phishing is no longer, I'm going to send you in an Excel document. Now we're focusing on mark of the web. Right? We're seeing adversaries focus on mark of the web. Mark of the web is an alternate data stream that's applied to a file when it's downloaded. There's a zone identifier of 3 that is applied to that file when it's downloaded. Now, this is how Windows controls the controls that are pushed against this. Defender looks for this. Smart Screen looks for this. If it's not present, certain code can run, right? In particular, VBA code. Now, mark of the web bypass has become one of the most pervasive methods of adversaries doing phishing. And for any of you who looked at the Microsoft updates from this past week, there was a mark of the web bypass in that particular update. That just tells you how pervasive this has become. So adversaries are phishing, but they have moved to mark of the web bypass as their main tactic. Now, mark of the web bypass has been in MITRE ATT&CK since 2021. But it was modified as recently as 2023. So this technique is something that we're seeing adversaries constantly use. So what are they trying to do when they do the mark of the web bypass? They are trying to run Visual Basic Code, or VBA, right? There's 2 different types of VBA codes. There's VBS, which is, kind of the weaker code, but then there's VBA. VBA is what runs in Office macros. VBA is a very, very powerful language. VBA can reach into the Windows API directly. So VBA can call virtual alloc and do process hollowing and do all of the things that executable code can do in a macro, in an Office document. That's Microsoft and their infinite wisdom. Sometimes they give things a little too much power. Now, Microsoft has put in some protections for VBA, and many of these have helped, but it's still not perfect, right? They created new formats, docx and docm. Many of you are probably familiar with those. Docx being the document format and docm being the document with macros format. If you have a macro in a docx file, odds are Defender's going to flag, right? It's going to say, hey, this is bad. Don't allow that to run. They also put protected view sandboxing in. So when you open up a XLSM or something like that, it's going to open in protected view by default in most cases, but it can't be edited. So what do users do? They click enable, right? They immediately allow it to be enabled and run. And then there's Microsoft Trust Center macro settings. You can cover these with group policy. You can make sure that no macros are run at the time you want them to run, but you have to make sure that you're controlling this particular area with your group policies. It's not the default, right? So by default, you have certain settings, but group policy should be put in place to change these. So an example of a mark of the web bypass is ISO files, right? ISO files were very, very common there for a little bit. Now, adversaries have moved away from this a little bit, but this is still a good example. If an ISO file is shipped into a user, what happens is the mark of the web is put on the outside container on the ISO file. The mark of the web itself does not propagate to the file inside. So what that means, the file inside does not have mark of the web and will be run as trusted code. Smart Screen will not run. It will run the VBA macros inside if they put, say, an XLSM with a macro in there. And I do have a follow-on video to this that's part of my YouTube channel that I'll reference later that I show this particular technique. But ISOs coming in, you don't want to let that happen, right? You don't want to let ISOs be coming into your environment. Now, Microsoft has done some things here to lessen the pain around VBA macros. In particularly, they have made it to where content doesn't auto-run. You have to enable content. But this is where your user awareness training has to come in, right? You have to make sure that your users know that if they hit that enable content button, they've let code run. Because what are adversaries doing? They're quite simply just putting phishing lures inside the file, right? It quite simply says, this document was created by a newer version of Office and macros must be enabled to display the contents. So a lot of users are going to go click that enable content button, right? And that's going to run the macro inside. Now, Trust Center may not allow that to run. It may put it in sandbox mode. It may not allow the user to do this, but that's something that is not the default. So make sure in your environment that you know what happens and that you are testing what happens when a user gets a file like this. Now, Microsoft has fixed a lot of this. Like I mentioned earlier, you can't just go download a file from the internet and have it run. VBA will not run on a file that has mark of the web. It just won't run. You'll get this Microsoft block macros from running because the source of this file is untrusted. Now, that's great, but that implies that mark of the web bypass has not happened. Now, I really love what they did here too, because it helps you, right? What they did here was they made it to where if the user clicks this right here, the learn more, that it takes them to user awareness training. Hey, might not be a great idea to click this enable content, right? Or download this thing from the internet. So that's helpful for your user awareness training. But if you're not testing these scenarios in your phishing tests, you're not fully testing how this works, right? You're not fully testing the infection vectors that adversaries are using. Now, I mentioned mark of the web bypass. I mentioned Microsoft and this back and forth that has happened. What happened is adversaries kind of got sick of the VBA dance. It still worked, but they were like, this isn't working well enough. So they just moved to OneNote. This is an example from TA 577. This is a OneNote file. And if you click that link right there, what it does is it runs JavaScript code. This runs JavaScript code, and it uses curl to download Qbot and install it. So they just moved to OneNote. They're like, oh, Microsoft didn't put the protection on OneNote. I've also seen them do this recently with other Office document formats. Publisher was another one. So there are many of these formats that you might not expect that you can run VBA code in. AutoCAD is one. VBA can run in AutoCAD. So how do you control that? You just have to test these things in your environment. But adversaries are doing these strange things. They're moving away from traditional phishing to get around Microsoft's controls. All right, how do we protect against the OneNote threat? Within your group policies, there are two settings that you can turn on. There's disable embedded files, and then there's embedded files blocked extensions. Disable embedded files completely disables any OneNote that has an embedded file. You cannot run it. It won't run, right? That's the nuclear option. It might not work in every environment. But embedded file blocked extensions, you can block certain file extension types from being used inside of a OneNote file. So I would definitely pick one of these and make sure that you're restricting OneNote files. Now, if you can't protect, you must be able to detect. Here's an example Sigma rule around how you can detect a OneNote file opening a illegitimate executable or a lol bin. So for example, here we have process creation as our Sigma rule. We have OneNote.exe as the parent process. And then here we have like bits admin, cert OC, cert util, cmd.exe. Now this, I couldn't get all of this on the slide, so check it out here. This is the Sigma project. But this was a very, very long Sigma rule. But you can take a Sigma rule and you can put it into any of your SIM products. There's a question, do these GPOs work for Office Online? They do. They do. Because they'll be local GPOs. They would apply to the end host. All right. So phishing is a bit upside down. How do we defend? We block abnormal file formats at the mail transfer agent. You don't want ISOs, VHDs, VHDX files, WON files, CAB files, link files. You just don't want them coming in. A lot of these are blocked by default by Microsoft stuff, but I find a lot of administrators have allowed things over the years. And once you allow it, it kind of stays, right? So you want to make sure that at your mail transfer agent that these cannot make it to your end user. You want to ensure that users are trained to identify these new forms of phishing. I just explained a completely different method than most people test. You need to test these methods, right? And then you need to use your GPOs to control your Office Trust Center and make sure that settings are correctly applied, right? So that will help you with the phishing. But what about our next phase, persistence and C2? So what we've observed, of course, is still a lot of Cobalt Strike, right? There's a lot of Cobalt Strike still out there. But we've also observed a massive shift to moving to legitimate utilities. Cobalt Strike might be the initial infection vector, and then they'll install a Terra, or they'll install AnyDesk, or GoToMeeting, or TeamViewer, or Splashtop, or name your next RMM, right? This has become very, very pervasive. One customer of ours had an infection, and the only way we detected them was by detecting a Terra being installed. They were remotely exploited. Asset was on the web that we weren't expecting it to be, and we detected a Terra, and that was how we found the initial infection, right? So just realize your C2 may not be the C2 you're thinking about. It may not be Cobalt Strike. It may not be Sliver. It could be just a legitimate utility. Now, this has been part of MITRE since 2018. But if you look through MITRE ATT&CK, you're not seeing them call out all of these different vendors. You're not seeing them put the onus on this that they should, right? These are being rampantly used for C2, right? Almost to the point that I'm seeing a lot less Cobalt Strike than I saw before because of these. So as I mentioned, C2's gotten kind of weird. AnyDesk, GoTo, a Terra, TeamViewer, Splashtop, you name it, it's being used. If they can get a trial, it's being used for a C2 engine. Now, a Terra in particular, just because I've used this for its C2 engine, when you install it, you can get a remote system PowerShell shell and a remote system cmd.exe. And you get GUI access. And a lot of these, you get GUI access, right? With Cobalt Strike, you don't get GUI access. You'd have to fashion some kind of RDP tunnel to do that. These are going to give you GUI access. And the reason adversaries are doing this is they're blending in. They want to blend in with the environment, right? If you use these utilities and then they install it, it's much harder for you to detect them. So in environments like this, you need to know basically where these are deployed, right? Because C2 has gotten pretty weird. And, you know, the joke is this. Do you remember when your C2 didn't sponsor a race car, right? Here we have TeamViewer on Petronas. Here's AnyDesk here, and then there's GoTo. Yeah, these are legitimate software, right? Adversaries are using it just as you would use it for remote management. So persistence at C2 has gotten a bit upside down. How do we defend? You're going to look for abnormal connections. In your next generation firewalls, if you have them, it should call out when something is TeamViewer or when it is a Terra or when it is AnyDesk. Look at these, right? It might be an adversary. It might not be your systems management team or your help desk. You need to add rules to SIEM and EDR solutions to alert on the installation of remote management software. Most of the time, these install as a service, right? And adversaries don't change it. They don't want to change it. They want it to look real. They want it to be the signed executable. They want it to be like, oh, no, I'm not here. Don't look here, right? So make sure that you know when TeamViewer is installed, when a Terra is installed, when AnyDesk is installed, that, hey, maybe this is a bad guy. Maybe I should look at this. And make sure that you're getting alerts, right? Because a lot of organizations don't even get alerts on this. Right? And your EDR most likely by default will not alert on this because it's legitimate software. It gets by EDR. And then finally, ensure you know where in your organization this type of software is used. Us as security professionals, we need to go talk to the systems administrators and make sure that we're aware of what they use, where they use it, and why they use it, right? Is there a better solution? Is there something that adversaries don't use? Can you use the regular VPN? Maybe you don't need this remote management software, right? All right. Privilege escalation. Here, we're still seeing LSAS dumping, but this has gotten weird as well. LSAS dumping nowadays is a little harder than it used to be. EDR's really got a good hold on LSAS dumping. Plus, there are technologies like Credential Guard that have minimized this. But most environments that I find still don't use Credential Guard because there were some requirements in the beginning to set that up. LSAS dumping, typically you are, as a red teamer, you're calling mini dump, right dump, you're dumping the credentials out of LSAS. But what adversaries realized is that if they dump the entirety of memory, that EDR might not trigger. And so they started using legitimate forensics tools to dump memory. So they just dump the entirety of memory. If your average laptop has 8 gigs of RAM and they dump an 8 gig file, do you think your org would notice an 8 gig file being uploaded to the web nowadays? Maybe, maybe not, right? So forensic utilities definitely being used by adversaries. Also, we're seeing stolen sign drivers. This has become pervasive. The stolen sign drivers is something that we're just seeing used all over the place. And the point of a stolen sign driver is if they have admin, they can install that stolen signed driver, install that stolen signed driver, getting twisted up there, and use it to stop protected processes. So many of you are familiar with Mimikatz and the mimikatz.sys driver, the driver that comes with Mimikatz. That's how Mimikatz can stop protected processes, and it can do things because it's closer to kernel space, right? So LSAS still the most common. MITRE mentions LSAS dumping. It does not mention using forensic utilities at all. Not at all, right? It also barely mentions driver installation, right? These are things that are pervasively being used by adversaries, and I'm not sure that we, as red teamers and purple teamers, are effectively testing this in our customer environments. So privilege escalation, as I mentioned, forensic utilities. We've seen WinPMIM, that's a really common one, Magnet RAM, FTK Imager, Belkasoft RAM Capture, anything that can capture RAM. They want to dump all of RAM, and they want to then steal that file, right? In one interesting case, we saw memprocfs used. Memprocfs is a utility used in DFIR situations when you want to mount a memory image either live on the box or off box to create a file system that you can go through. They mounted the memory, then they used curl to exfil a file. We are assuming that was an LSAS dump being done by memprocfs, right? So if you can use a legitimate forensic utility to dump LSAS and it gets by EDR, what good is the EDR, right? So you need to know where these utilities are being used, right? What does the adversary do once they get the memory dump? And it wouldn't be a sans talk if we didn't talk about volatility. They can bring it into volatility. Volatility, the standard for memory analysis, gold standard for memory forensics. It supports raw linear samples, crash dump files, EWF files, hibernation files, and VMware save state snapshot files. If the adversary can get any of these files that contain memory, they can then go into volatility and quite simply do the hash dump. So right here, you see this is my lab. I did sudo python 3 vol pi file, my physmem raw file. That was the file that I dumped. And then I can do Windows hash dump, hash dump. And here are the hashes. So adversary steals the whole of memory. They dump the hashes. It's the same as if they dumped LSAS. So they can now replay this administrator hash. They could replay my hash here. They could replay this test user. Not really that hard to do. All right, stealing and using signed drivers. This, and also forged driver certificates to make their own drivers, right? So this allows attackers to stop protected processes. And what are they interested in stopping? Your EDR. They want to shut your EDR off. So they will get a driver, they will load it onto the system, and they'll shut off whatever protected processes are there, right? How they're able to do this is they can get very close to ring 0 with a device driver. They're not really down here in user space as much. They're up here closer to kernel, right? This became so pervasive that Microsoft has notified its Windows hardware developer program that, hey, this was happening. If you're developing drivers, watch for this, right? They're being stolen. And then there is a new project or project. Many of you may have heard of this, loldrivers.io. This is a project that inventories exploitable drivers and then provides a list of these drivers. They also provide a Sigma rule for detecting the compromised drivers. And then you can also get a threat intelligence feed and take it into like MISP or one of your threat intelligence management solutions and push it out to SIM everywhere. So you can absolutely detect a stolen device driver that's being used. This is what loldrivers.io looks like. It's just a category of those particular things. If you've gone to the website, it looks like this. You could just click this box down here and get the threat intel feed loaded into your system, and you can create rules off this. I highly suggest you do this. Now, how do we defend against this privilege escalation? We're going to look for the execution of forensics tools. Many will install drivers and services. Also, any of those drivers that are malicious drivers will be installed as well. But what we're going to be looking for is execution. So VentID 4688 is process execution. This is the Windows version of that. There is also the Sysmon 1. If you have Sysmon installed in your environments, you can use Sysmon 1, and you can look for these drivers being installed in your systems. You can look for the execution of these forensic utilities as well, right? Now, 7045 is service installation. And the reason you would want service installation is a lot of the time when drivers are installed, they must be installed as a service. So you can match the service name with the name of the known bad driver, or you can hash that and match the hashes. So that's definitely a good way to go. You want to add rules to SIM and EDR solutions to alert on the installation of forensic tools and drivers from loldrivers.io. You guys are going to get tired of hearing me say this. This is going to be repetitive throughout, right? Tune your SIM and EDR solutions to alert on these things we're talking about, these strange things that adversaries are doing. And ensure you know if your internal forensics team use any of these solutions and where they use them. Yeah, you got to go talk to people, right? You have to know, hey, on this machine over here, we're using WinPMM today. It's not the bad guy, right? All right, recon. More odd tools. Some of these have been around for a little bit, but some of them are very unexpected. right? AD find. AD find has become so pervasive that Defender is now actively blocking it in a lot of cases. A lot of EDR solutions are actively blocking it. AD find is a utility that is legitimate. It was developed for systems administrators so that they could query Active Directory to get information. This one has been used on so many intrusions, so many, right? And it's getting worse. It seems like that has almost replaced Sharphound in a lot of cases, which is wild. NBT scan, seen this one used in many intrusions as well. Advanced IP scanner. This is a GUI IP scanner. And typically when I see this detected, it shows up in EDR as a potentially unwanted program. It doesn't show up as anything malicious. So you might get an alert here, but it might not be enough for you to understand, hey, maybe this host is compromised, right? Net scan, that soft perfect net scan, very common, kind of the same thing as advanced IP scanner. And then ping castle. Ping castle is an AD utility that is used to determine where you have weaknesses in AD. Now, adversaries are, of course, using these legitimate tools to find out information about Active Directory and gain network awareness. They're trying to discover things. Once they've got their foothold, they've got their beacon, they're then discovering things in your environment with these tools. And because they're legitimate tools, a lot of EDR solutions and a lot of SIMs are not going to alert on this, right? Now, MITRE mentions AD find and NBT scan, but none of the other tools are mentioned. And then here, my question is, do you know if your EDR and SIM alerts on these at all? And if it doesn't, maybe you should. So a little bit more in depth on these discovery tools, in particular, Ping Castle. Ping Castle is a very interesting utility. It was developed by Vincent Lateau. Vincent Lateau is one of the co-founders of Mimikatz. And I'll go into that in a little more detail here in a second. Advanced IP scanner, of course, is just a GUI network scanner. I've seen this one used in many intrusions. It provides just straight up network scanning, right? I'm scanning whatever's in my subnet. I'm finding open ports. Adversaries can use that to their advantage. And then soft perfect network scan, another one, right? So a lot of the time you'll find your admins are using these tools. If they're using these tools, you need to know where and when and why. Why aren't you using something else, right? All right, Ping Castle, as I mentioned, developed by Vincent Lateau. Its motto is that it will get you to 80% of Active Directory security in 20% of the time. Many of you have probably used this tool before, but this one will create a score for you and a HTML output of what your vulnerabilities are, or what your weaknesses are, or what your hardening policy hasn't covered. Well, if an adversary gets a hold of this, it's bad all day, right? Maybe you haven't reset your KRBT TGT account ever, and they can do golden ticket attacks if they have domain admin. They're going to get that level of information, right? So we've seen this one used in quite a few intrusions. Ping Castle used in many intrusions. This is a great tool for the blue team, though. If you haven't run this in your environment, I highly suggest you do, but maybe you write rules around its usage so that you know when anybody else is using it in your environment. But this one in particular, very, very good for a blue team tool, will highlight many of the weaknesses in Active Directory, but it has been used by adversaries now quite frequently. So discovery tools, how do we defend? We look for 4688, we look for Sysmon 1, right? The only difference here is in the case of Ping Castle and some of these, you also want to look for event ID 4104. This is PowerShell script block. PowerShell script block will notify you whenever a script is run from a Windows perspective, right? If you're running a script, it will show up in event ID 4104. In the case of Ping Castle, it's running from scripts. So the only way to really detect that is PowerShell 4104. Right? Now you want to retroactively threat hunt for these tools throughout your environment. If you find that you suddenly find AD find on a system, well, you should probably hunt throughout your entire environment and find out why AD find is there. Because now it's an indicator of compromise, right? Or an indicator of attack. It no longer is just, oh yeah, that's a random executable that one of the admins is using. Because now you know that adversaries are using it as part of intrusions. And once again, as I said, you're going to get tired of hearing me say some of these things. Ensure you know if your internal teams are using any of these products. If they're using these products, then you need to know where and when so that you can find what normal is. If you can't find what normal is, you can't figure out what abnormal is, which means an adversary could get in there, run this tool, and you would not know at all, right? All right. Now we get into actions on objectives. This one's really interesting. New tunneling methods. Adversaries have adopted tunneling tools that are used by developers. In particular, ngrok. ngrok, widely used by developers, but also widely used by adversaries. Why is this used by adversaries? Because it can walk right through your firewall. They can bring any port that they want outside of your firewall with ngrok. Microsoft Dev Tunnels is another example of this. Microsoft Dev Tunnels is just basically Microsoft's version of ngrok. ngrok is it can be well detected in some environments, but dev tunnels are never detected, but adversaries have started using these. And then, of course, Tailscale. Tailscale is WireGuard. It is the enterprise version of WireGuard, but they provide a trial, so adversaries are using Tailscale as well. Now, also some other non-standard tunneling tools or non-standard tools that we're seeing as part of exfiltration is we're seeing rclone. rclone is a cloud utility that allows an adversary to take a file and upload it to whatever cloud they choose. There's a whole bunch of different clouds that it works with. So for their purposes, they load rclone, and if AWS S3 is blocked or Azure Blob Storage is blocked, then they can send it to Mega, and they don't even have to change their tool, right? They don't have to write a new script. So they're using rclone quite pervasively. FileZilla, they're using FileZilla for FTP transfers. Now, this one's hard because this is one of the most commonly used applications for FTP and SFTP out there. So this one is pretty tough to get a hold of. If you know your organization doesn't use this, then you should block this with tools like AppBlocker and WDAC. If they do use it, you got to know where. Curl. Curl is now part of Windows. That surprises a lot of people when I say that. But yes, they have added curl to Windows. So an adversary can quite simply curl a file out of your network just by using the built-in Windows utility. And then, of course, PowerShell scripts. This has been around as a vector for a long time, but still pervasive in intrusions. Now, MITRE mentions ngrok for exfiltration tunneling, but not any of these other methods. They mention ngrok. MITRE also mentions rclone, but it doesn't specifically call out that it's used for exfiltration. It just mentions it as a tool. So digging into this a little further, attackers typically deploy these tunneling tools to open up things that they don't normally have access to, in particularly RDP. I can open up RDP and SSH and SMB from the internet because I can tunnel it through ngrok and then I can hit my ngrok endpoint. So you bought this awesome next generation firewall. It blocks SMB to the internet. It blocks RDP going to the internet. Well, guess what? Adversary uses ngrok. It tunnels through TLS and it's open. ngrok has also been started to be used heavily by malware authors. We had a customer that found a bunch of NJRAT that was related to ngrok. The only way they detected it is when we put a rule in place to determine where ngrok was in their network. It's pretty wild. Microsoft Dev Tunnels, basically the same thing as I mentioned. It does the exact same functionality as ngrok. Tailscale is interesting because it is a full VPN, but it is also UDP, right? So it may not be something you're typically looking for, but if you don't use WireGuard or Tailscale and you suddenly see that used in your network, you should probably look into it. Now, developer tunneling applications, as I mentioned, they can tunnel RDP to the internet. So we see TCP 3389 here. It goes through the tunnel to ngrok, and the end user hits the tunnel IP and the tunnel port. So here's an example of that. If I point RDP to this TCP0 TCP AP ngrok IO at 11.816, it tunnels it to 3389 on the host. So I would hit here, go through the tunnel through the firewall, and be able to hit SMB, RDP, SSH, right? Not great. Think about this. This is like Netcat. Everybody blocks Netcat. You shouldn't be able to do this port magic. Well, guess what? The developers developed something and it's a legitimate tool. And now you need to know where this is used in your environment, right? Digging into rclone, FileZilla. rclone, like I mentioned, copy data to multiple different clouds. You can copy it to a whole bunch of different clouds out there. I think it's 30 or 40 different variants. If you ever see anybody copy anything to mega.io, you probably should look into that. But rclone does support Mega, but it also supports S3 and any of the legitimate clouds out there. FileZilla, as I mentioned, very, very common for FTP transfers in an organization. This one's hard to get your hands around because FTP in general is a pretty pervasive file transfer method. And FileZilla in general is one of the most used applications out there. So you need to know where in your org this is used. And that's challenging because it could be anywhere. This one could be anywhere. Now, curl. I mentioned curl before. Curl is now part of Windows. How can you get a file out with curl? You do simply curl x post, you give it a key value, and you send it to a URL. Done. Exfil complete. That's pretty scary. This is built into Windows, right? So maybe you want to look when curl is used in your environment. Now, this is exfiltration. This implies that we are looking at espionage, espionage threat actors. In ransomware groups, we're seeing some other tools. They're starting to use basically anything they can execute to maximize their ransom. IO-bit unlocker is one of the most common ones that we've seen. IO-bit unlocker, what it does is it unlocks a locked file. If you have a locked file, the encryption run can't access it, so therefore it can't be encrypted. So what are adversaries doing? They're loading IO-bit unlocker, they're unlocking all the files, and then they're running their encryption run. And then that file that they weren't able to encrypt, they can now encrypt. So if you see IO-bit unlocker, that's a strange tool, right? It still works, and this is legitimate. It will slip by EDR. We did observe in one intrusion the adversary logging into the Veeam console and deleting the backups interactively. Now, this could literally be any backup software vendor, right? But if the adversary can get a hold of your backup software console, then they can delete your backups. So where that Veeam client is run or where your client is run for any of your backup software, you need to know when and where it's run. Because what if it's an adversary? What if they're doing some of these stranger things I'm telling you about? And then finally, PSExec. I included this one just because it's well known that this one is used by adversaries, but this particular method I hadn't seen a lot of before. In this particular intrusion, they used PSExec to literally copy the ransomware down to every workstation and execute it. Usually we saw WMIC for that or PowerShell, but in this case, we saw simple PSExec. And does EDR alert on PSExec? No, in a lot of cases, right? No. Unless you have some kind of normalization suite that's looking for, hey, we've never seen this before, you might not get alerted here. So, of course, you should have protection around PSExec. All right. How do we defend on these things for actions on objectives, right? You're going to look for evidence of these tunneling things in your next generation firewalls. If you have a next generation firewall, one of the newer ones, Palo, Sonic Wall, anything, right? Cisco. If you have any of those vendors and they do application awareness, you will see, hey, this is TeamViewer. Hey, this is Atera. That should alert you, especially if you don't use it in your environment, right? As I mentioned before, that was how we caught an intrusion in one of our customers. You should, if you don't have next generation firewalls and you do have proxies, you can do the same thing in proxies. Now, because this is legitimate software, you can get all the known IP addresses and DNS names for these legitimate softwares, and you can put them in as rules if you don't have a next-gen firewall. So that's another way you can do this. You need to retroactively threat hunt and create SIM and EDR alerts for these tools, especially misused tools like rclone, PSExec, IOBit. You need to be looking for these. First off, if you don't have a handle on PSExec in 2024, you're not doing well, right? Adversaries use this all the time. Your admins should have moved on to something better like PowerShell by this point. They shouldn't be using PSExec. rclone, if you see it, man, this one is I almost never see this in a legitimate way, right? It could be used legitimately, but I almost never see this in a legitimate way. And then IOBIT, same thing, kind of rare. You should be alerted to its usage. Once again, you've got to ensure you know where your internal teams are using these tools. This is the hard part with the adversaries that do stranger things. You got to go talk to your sysadmins. They've got to tell you that they use PSExec. They've got to tell you that they're using IOBIT. They've got to tell you that they're using rclone, or else you're going to be chasing false positives all the time, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, any of these utilities that you don't use, you can block with WDAC. WDAC is Windows Defender for Application Control. It is built into Windows Enterprise. It is the successor to AppLocker. This means any executable or signature or path, you can block its execution. And it doesn't have to be the whitelisting model or the allow listing model. It can be a blacklisting model or a disallow model where you say that you cannot run this particular executable ever, right? That's what you want to do with these utilities that you know adversaries are using, and that you can't, you want to control them. You know your team should never use them. Block them with WDAC, right? WDAC being the successor. There is also a list of lull bins that Microsoft provides for WDAC that you can use to help you with these, which means that if some of these odd utilities call CMD or they use a weird method, cert util, you can block that with WDAC too. So in summary, we go back to our attack chain. Our initial compromise isn't just phishing anymore. It's mark of the web bypass, OneNote files. Our foothold, it might not be Cobalt Strike beacons. It might be TeamViewer, AnyDesk, Atera. Our escalation of privileges might be forensic tools or driver installation. Our discovery might be AD-Find, Advanced IP Scanner, NetScan, PingCastle. Our lateral movement could be TeamViewer, AnyDesk, Atera, GoTo. Our actions on objectives could be rclone, FileZilla, tunneling mechanisms that are for devs like ngrok, Microsoft Dev Tunnels. Or you could see PSExec running all over your network. Are you as red teamers? Are you as purple teamers testing these? Most people I talk to are not, right? So this means we are not effectively emulating the adversary. We need to effectively emulate the adversary to be good red teamers and be good purple teamers. So hopefully you learned something here and you have, you can see the forest for the trees now. But ways to stay ahead of the adversary. Ensure your threat intelligence is driving your adversary emulation program. When you see a new tactic used by an adversary, when you find out they're using a new tool, you need to retroactively hunt that throughout your environment. But threat intelligence is what tells you that they did that, right? Unless you are constantly, surveying intrusions yourself, you can use threat intelligence to provide these tools to you and say, hey, okay, somebody used IOBIT on an intrusion. Well, maybe we should retroactively hunt for that in our environment, right? And you need to use execution blocking at some level, right? You should be using AppLocker or WDAC to block executables that you know are bad. If your team does not use FileZilla, use WDAC to block that. If you can't block it, you must detect, right? You have to detect its usage. But I highly suggest just using the built-in tools in Windows to help you in blocking these known strange executables that maybe your teams don't use. Or you start with blocking it, and then whoever screams, say, hey, I'm using this tool, it's blocked. Well, yeah, because adversaries use it, right? All right, some resources for further study here. I have a video demonstration series that I'm doing on my YouTube channel. If you go to bit.ly, Adversaries, Stranger Things, the first video is up there. This is a direct link to that. It will show you the first stage of an intrusion. It shows mark of the web bypass, VBA getting by Defender, a UAC bypass, and then the installation of Atera being completely blind to the end user and getting right by Defender. I'm going to walk through each of these stages in a video series for my YouTube channel. Feel free to check that out. Intelligence reports. If you don't have good threat intelligence that you pay for, then the deferreport.com, definitely a good resource for this. You can find all sorts of documented intrusions, and you can comb through those and find some of the stranger things that adversaries are doing and incorporate that into your programs. This is my YouTube channel where I demonstrate all sorts of red team tools. Feel free to check that out. As you know, a lot of the stuff I'm doing or a lot of stuff I'm experimenting with from a purple or red team perspective, I will show here. I almost always show the detection of the tool as well. So if I'm showing Kerber roasting, I'm showing you how to detect Kerber roasting. And then, of course, you can come take Sec 599, Defeating Advanced Adversaries, Purple Team Tactics, and Kill Chain Defenses with me or any of the wonderful SANS instructors that teach this course. It's a really interesting course because throughout the entirety of the course, you are doing the attack. You are then doing the defense. So you get that full Purple Team experience. And that's it. Do we have any questions?
Hi, Brian. We did have one come through that we haven't addressed yet within your presentation. And that question is, how do you go about testing or emulating against EDRs? EDR companies are making it difficult to obtain a license, especially for security researchers.
Yeah, that's a really tough scenario. What I recommend is that you work with your EDR vendor and you emulate against that particular EDR vendor that your organization uses. That's the one you need to be the most focused on. In my case, I've been lucky. I work for a systems integrator and we get licenses for all of these different utilities that most of our customers use. So that's a tough one to answer. I know that a lot of EDR vendors don't like you testing against their stuff, but you kind of have to. You must know what works and what doesn't work, especially against the EDR for your particular customer, right? Or your particular engagement that you're working on right then. But if you're talking about bypass testing, that gets very sticky very fast. They will come down on you. If you're doing bypass testing, they will know you're doing it and they don't like it. So you're correct in that statement, but what I usually recommend is just test against the one that your enterprise is using, know what that looks like, tell the vendor you're going to test them. And if they push back, maybe it's time to look at another EDR vendor.
Great, thank you
Other
for that.
questions?
That was the only one that wasn't addressed during your presentation, so thank you so much for your response. Also want to say thank you so much for your presentation and for helping to bring content like this to the SANS community. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. You can find your CPEs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigating to your account dashboard, then clicking My Webcasts. You can then download your CPE on the right-hand side of the webpage. And until next time, thank you so much and take care.
Thanks, everyone.